Thank you so much, everyone. Now, let me introduce our wonderful speakers today. So today with us, we have Lizzie Houlding and Valerie Lannon. Lizzie is a Spring member and organizing in the one of our lead organizers in the Ottawa-Gatineau region. She works as a physiotherapist at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario and is a steward in her union, OPSU Local 474. She also sits on the board of Horizon Ottawa, a grassroots municipal advocacy group, and has been involved in the climate organizing for several years. Valerie is also a member of Spring and one of the founders of Spring Socialist Group. She has worked extensively with Indigenous communities and has been active with Toronto 350 and also with the Justice for Workers campaign. But before I pass it to our speakers, just a couple of really quick notes about how the meeting is going to go. So we'll have our speakers present for about 30 to 35 minutes. Then we'll have some time for comments and questions from all of you. We're not going to be back and forth in the Q&A between the speakers and the audience. Rather, we're going to hear from you. They'll take notes, and then we'll have some time at the end for them to offer any final thoughts and concluding remarks, as well as answer any questions. I'll tell you a little bit after about how the Q&A is going to work. I'm not going to do that right now because we are a little bit late, but just one quick last thing is that we encourage all of you to post on social media throughout the conference. So if you're doing that, you can share any thoughts, any experiences about the sessions, and you can use the Red October 2025 hashtag, and also tag Spring on all platforms at SpringMag.ca. Okay, without further ado, Valerie.
Thanks so much, Mina, and thanks everyone for being here with us today. So this talk is the first in the series in the conference called Strategies and Tactics. And strategies and tactics we all do for any campaign to make any kind of major decision. But I thought it might be helpful to quote from the pamphlet of the same name by the British Marxist John Rees. He says, "As Marx said, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it." And then he goes on to say, "Marxism is distinguished from all other sociological theories and left-wing doctrines by its insistence on answering the question, what is to be done? Other doctrines, academic and political, may analyze and observe the social reality around them, but it is Marxism's commitment to acting upon such analyses that marks it out. This commitment to the unity of theory and practice points towards some other fundamental aspects of Marxism. It raises the question, for instance, of who is going to do whatever it is that needs to be done. And it asks the question, which class and what political actors in that class are capable of making change happen? Spring, as a revolutionary socialist organization, assesses strategies and tactics through three pillars. First one being centering equity in everything we do. Secondly, assuming socialism from below, or a mass rank and file approach that doesn't wait for elected leaders to act. And thirdly, using revolutionary journalism to tell workers' stories of struggles and lessons learned and to bolster confidence. Lizzie and I prepared for this talk by identifying what we think are the key questions and reflecting on our own experiences, doing some great reading. I'm happy to share some of those readings with you if you like. And what we want to talk about today are, what do we mean by climate justice? What is the role of the working class in making societal change? What are the common goals between the climate justice and the labor movements? And what is the common context in which they're engaging in struggle? What are the barriers to a closer alliance between these two movements? And some historical examples of good collaboration. And as always, what is to be done, both in the short and long terms. So to begin, I'll ask Lizzie, what do we in Spring mean by climate justice?
Thank you, Valerie, for the introduction. I'm so sorry. There we go. So yeah, I mean, anyone who's worked in climate organizing knows that climate justice can mean a lot of different things to different people. So for today, like for our definition, I wanted to go off of those three principles of Spring that Valerie mentioned, of socialism, of revolution, of organization. So for the first principle, socialism and also centering equity, I think that it's really important that climate justice be centering equity and be centering like humanism and valuing, human life. in the fight against capitalist extraction. In the climate movement, I don't know, like, again, I'm assuming folks here maybe have dipped their toes into the climate movement a bit, but it's really easy to get sucked into this kind of nihilism and this like really anti-human mindset where humans are just kind of considered this plague upon the world, and that we should start to veer towards these kind of eco-fascist solutions to that, and in this mindset, human activity is inherently harmful and bad, whether that be like eating a sandwich or driving your kids to work. It kind of, we start to slip into this like really over focus on our consumption. And drawing on socialist principles and critiques of colonialism and capitalism, I think, is a really potent solution to this mindset. Understanding that people's actions are shaped by their systems and their circumstances. It's not necessarily people themselves that are bad. And justice means that we are centering those who are most affected, and those who are most affected get a say in what our solutions look like, whether that be climate refugees, Indigenous communities who are impacted by pipelines, energy sector workers who are being faced with losing their income. And I also find that Indigenous ways of knowing help to provide a really good way to approach this. Kind of an understanding that we are in relationship with the land, and it's not just that we are this kind of separate entity from the land, and that there's an interconnectedness rather than positioning humans as something that's just other and bad. The second principle is revolution. And I think that true climate justice really reckons with widespread harms, both human and environmental, that are necessary to uphold capitalism. And I think this isn't opposed to kind of this reformist strategy. And we know that there's hundreds of Canadian NGOs which employ thousands of workers that are trying to kind of work in government relations to convince the government to do the right thing. And I know this especially because I live in Ottawa and I have a lot of friends who work in government relations. And we can see really clearly that it is not working. The government is aligned with the capital class. They have no interest from divesting from fossil fuels. The capital class is much more afraid of losing their status and their investments in fossil capital than they are in the environmental impacts of climate change. And this mindset kind of comes across as completely illogical to the everyday person. So it's understandable. Like, I understand why my friends are like, if we just talk to them enough, they'll get it. And surely even billionaires kind of care about their children's ability to breathe clean air and have stable weather. But it's important to remember that the logics of capitalism are completely illogical. Even, our children's future will always come secondary to profit and the economy. And so we must have a struggle against the state if we want to even extract modest wins from the state. And the third principle of Spring is to organize. The climate justice movement needs to be led by a broad base of working class support if we want to be successful. So this means systematic rank and file organizing, which is the bread and butter of labor activism, having one-on-one conversations, talking to people who don't necessarily agree with you right off the bat. And so I think these are all really essential things, and we'll get into them a bit more. But I touched on the working class. I wanted to ask Valerie, what is the role that the working class needs to play in winning climate justice?
Funny you should ask that. And just to build on what Lizzie finished saying, that it's not a question of trying to educate the oil companies and the governments that serve them. And it's not a matter of replacing the CEOs with, kinder, gentler, more with it people, because the profit motive is baked right into capitalism, as is the need for corporate owners to control what we produce, how we produce it, and how things get distributed. And all of that is non-negotiable from their point of view. So far from negotiating change, we as the working class need to seize the power for ourselves. We need to replace capitalism completely with an economic system and social system that puts people's needs first. And that's the starting point from which all our other decisions would be made. In other words, socialism. There are many kinds of power struggles, and many represent class interests. For example, tenant strikes, public protests against wars and privatization, etc., the magnificent Palestine Solidarity Movement. But it is the organized working class acting in its interests, not only in the streets, but in the workplace, that is the only force that can take down capitalism. Not only do workers form the greatest part of the population, it's only workers who produce the wealth, who build stuff, who operate stuff, who work the call centers and everything else. A mass strike would involve workers taking over the workplaces and at times has expanded historically to take over distribution of goods such as food or electricity. But that's not enough. Workers not only need to take over their workplaces, they need to take power over society and the state as a whole. You can ignore the state, but the state's not ignoring you, right? They can't leave any trace of the corporate alienating, competitive, soul and planet-destroying ruling structures, laws, and practices. We need to fight for reforms, though, in the here and now, to improve living standards and to fight oppression. But unless we want these to be endless battles, we need a socialist revolution to completely replace capitalism. And it's only workers in their billions taking over and completely transforming their workplaces and the organs of state power, like the armed forces and the legislatures, who can achieve this. So, based on what I've just said, what would you say are some of the common goals between the climate justice and labor movements, and is there some common context in which they're operating?
Yeah, so I think both climate and worker movements face really similar problems. One of the big ones is how do we orient towards class war rather than culture war? And I think everyone can agree we're really in a context where we're being pushed towards this kind of culture war, and our goals are being pitted against each other. So, there's a rise of austerity, militarism, racism, censorship, transphobia, the far right in general. And in Canada also kind of this idea of nation building projects being put above everything else. How often do we hear it that we can't focus on climate demands because we need to focus on ensuring jobs for energy sector workers? That's kind of like a really common thing. But then in the same breath, Carney will claim that we can't invest in employment insurance for these workers impacted by tariffs because we can't afford to invest in public services in this time of crisis, in this time of high inflation. And then if you look at where the high inflation is coming from, one of the reasons is the climate crisis. So it's kind of our goals are often being pitted against each other regardless of what we do. I think one of the examples I wanted to use to kind of demonstrate this is the rise of anti-migrant sentiment. It's a really common argument that's also used to drive a wedge between climate organizers, between labor organizers. Despite being key workers in the Canadian economy, producing food, producing essential goods, doing critical care work, migrants are painted as kind of freeloaders or stealing jobs or stealing our services from our healthcare system. And despite being the most vulnerable to the climate disaster, migrants are also sometimes painted as the villains of the climate movement. And I think that the climate movement needs to really address that issue within our discourse. And degrowth and depopulation arguments drive anti-migrant sentiment even among climate activists. And so I think proactive education and organizing and building solidarity through struggle is really key to inoculate workers and climate activists against this kind of divisive argument. And so, I touched upon some of the barriers already, but what do you think the barriers are to a closer alliance between labor and climate movements?
Well, before I get to crapping on both groups, which I will, I think it's really important to just recall what Lizzie had just said, that we're operating in a context where the oil companies and the governments have never done much for either the environment or the working class. That's the biggest challenge at all. And also, as you were saying, the government has no commitment to any worker, whether in the fossil sector or not, when they lose their jobs. Compared to 20 years ago, the employment insurance program is broken. It's harder to qualify. The benefit period is shorter, and the benefits themselves are lower. And on top of that, when we're talking about job loss in the fossil sector, there's never been historically, I don't think I've heard a few examples in European countries now and then, but what's called just transition. So someone's going to lose their job, the whole sector is going to go down. What happens to those workers? And usually it's like a quick training, 2 weeks, and then see ya, and you're on your own, if that, right? And so when workers hear about just transition, they've heard that song before. So whether we're talking about the fishing industry or, all that kind of stuff, there's nothing around financial compensation, retraining, and, just dignity. And whether we're talking about so-called green jobs like rewilding or restoring habitat or, building solar panels, etc., The governments and the corporations always look the other way. And just a couple of years ago, perfect example in Oshawa, when General Motors, first they're going to shut down the whole plant, and then they opened it on a much reduced basis. And the union said, hey, why don't we retrofit this plant? We're skilled workers, and let's start producing electric vehicles for the government fleets, all the cars, all the trucks. There's like gazillions of them, right? Didn't go anywhere. And another way of looking at this is that, as you were saying, like when we think of the care sector, health, education, social services, all those jobs are essential. Many of them within those sectors are precarious, underpaid, and yet they're no or low carbon jobs. So that's another way of thinking, like, why doesn't the government raise up, the status and pay, et cetera, and stability of those jobs instead? So, in terms of the union movement, there understandably is going to be a reluctance to completely embrace a fossil-free structure, a fossil-free future, I should say, as long as workers in that sector are going to face financial ruin because there is no truly just transition. There are some differences between private sector unions and public sector unions in terms of policy positions that you can read about. But as long as one sector of the union movement is resisting, the whole movement, in an act of solidarity really, resists decarbonization. And there are some exceptions to that, but that's the reason you're not seeing wholesale take-up. Even in a big union like the steelworkers, you have everything from people who actually, make the pipelines to people like all the admin staff at U of T are in steelworkers. So you've got debates inside unions as well. Another weakness of the union movement is its tendency to focus its discussion around green jobs as just those that create new types of work for those in the fossil sector, and not enough talking about the jobs in the caring sector. The Canadian Labour Congress had a report in 2023 called A Sustainable Jobs Blueprint, and it's a perfect example of that kind of weakness. As for the environmental movement, broadly speaking, there's a lack of understanding of the strategic role of the working class. They've come to appreciate the value of unions, but often it's, oh yeah, we can get a whole bunch of people out and have their banners, and you know what, we can go to their office and they'll let us photocopy, but no understanding of that really strategic role that I was describing earlier, that it's only the working class that can produce the revolution that we need. And even, just last month, the September 20th Draw the Line protest. I mean, it was fantastic to see all these movements coming together, big numbers, great energy. But if you look at the organizers' demands, there actually were some important statements there around migrant rights, to give them credit, but nothing around, the right to unionize, no vision of what decent work would look like. And there's no vision, I don't think, of workers' roles as producers of wealth. It's more that workers are consumers and, bad consumers at that. Green New Deal. The Green New Deal, and it read New Deal, but the Green New Deal was a bit better known, much touted in North America in 2019, did make those kind of unifying demands, actually, and had pretty big uptake in the States. There was a sunset movement, etc. But those movements have largely disappeared. If I say LEAP, does anybody know what I'm talking about? We'll talk later. But it was in the forefront in Canada. Avi Lewis was one of its founders, and like I said. So while these ideas live on in some circles, the important links between labor and climate justice at the scale that we need have yet to be made. And as the American Marxist Michael Ware has argued, we should not let organized socialists off the hook either. We need to bring our socialist analysis, our class analysis, into climate justice debates and initiatives. For example, exposing why green capitalism doesn't work, why international conflicts are usually rooted in fossil capitalism. I will say, I think in the last few decades, the level of and sophistication of analysis has improved. I think the bad old days when first earthers would not have any problems, injuring loggers if it kept them away from logging. And there's more talk of system change as opposed to individual, changing your light bulbs kind of thing. I've seen less action by the big environmental groups trying to intervene with First Nations communities, to say, we're going to save your environment. But as Lizzie was saying earlier, there are still big debates that get in the way of a true alliance. Long-standing arguments about the need for a lower population continue to be made, which is at odds with the real causes of climate crisis. And more recently, the degrowth and ecological austerity arguments are interpreted quite correctly by many workers as yet another argument for substantial job loss and personal financial catastrophe. But all is not lost. Do you have any examples of some good collaboration?
Yeah, so I wanted to focus on it just, one example of a strong coalition between climate and justice, and this is the story of the Florence, Italy, GKN driveline factory workers. So. The driveline GKN factory in Florence, it was a factory that produced, well, it exists kind of today, produced axle shafts for luxury vehicles since the 1990s. And it was first owned by Fiat, and then it was bought by GKN in 2018. And, then it was bought by an asset stripping company. And by 2021, they announced that they were closing the factory immediately. And in 2022, the workers received a notice of mass layoff. And so usually in these cases, what unions will do is they will try to negotiate kind of the conditions of their mass layoff. They'll try to work for better severance pay, try to lessen the sting. But in this case, there was a high level of militancy among the workers, and the GKN factory workers responded by occupying the factories in a fight against decommissioning. And this is the longest factory occupation in the history of Italy. But what makes it really interesting is that the strategy adopted by the workers really sealed an alliance with the climate justice movement. They drafted a conversion plan for sustainable public transport and suggested an alternative for their factory on a cooperative basis, producing photovoltaic panels, batteries, and cargo bikes rather than luxury car parts. So this is a quote from one of the workers. "We have this reindustrialization project, which looks at renewable energy, at the ecological transition, and at low carbon mobility by making solar panels and cargo bikes, which are special pedal-assisted electric bikes. So truly an all-green project that is 100% recyclable." And so this has been a really incredible example of how they were able to forge this relationship with the climate movement. March 25th, they put together a kind of a proposal which was signed by hundreds of associations from unions, student movements, parties, social centers, civic lists, celebrity personalities. And it closed with the slogan, "Let's break the siege and let's try to make the future," which I'm sure was really snappy in Italian. This strategy challenged many of the misconceptions about the climate action that we've already talked about. So it challenged the idea that labor interests and environmental interests are necessarily at odds. But more importantly, it challenged the predominant strategy in the climate movement, the kind of idea of climate action from above, that the climate action should be enacted or could be enacted by elites if we just kind of replace with the right, leader, the right elite, that they would start to kick the just transition into gear, and the ideology of neoliberalism. It acted through rank and file organizing from below, and that ensured a strategy in which leaders are accountable and can't capitulate to worker or climate demands or fool themselves that the climate justice is aligned with the interests of capitalist elites. And so this is actually an ongoing project. They continue to fight for their jobs, and they've formed a collective called the GKN Factory Collective, and a portion of the original workers are continuing to organize to restart production at the factory. And so I think it's going to be something for us to watch. And obviously, one project like this can't is not necessarily going to kickstart a revolution, but it's something for us to kind of learn a lesson from. And what we want is for workers to be learning the lesson that rank and file organizing means that you can have sustained wins, not just the crumbs of better severance or things like that. And so, with this example, the question is, what do we do next in the short term?
That's a question for all of you, but I will take a stab at it. In spring, when we think about change, how change happens, we always put a premium on the actions that are going to build the confidence of the working class. If you think of a particular tactic or strategy, is this going to build people's confidence or is it going to undermine their confidence? There are decisions around what to do, how to do it, and to relate to rank and file workers, not necessarily the elected leaders. We want to help build actions that can involve as many people as possible. But having said that, we don't rely on, as I mentioned, elected leaders, whether that's union leaders or NDP people that we might have voted in, but nor do we rely on a so-called militant few acting on our behalf. For these reasons, and given that we are not in any kind of pre-revolutionary situation, to say the least, we need to see and understand how seemingly small victories open up opportunities to the bigger and more transformative struggles to come. These smaller victories help build workers' confidence to take on the bigger struggles. And trying to stop fossil fuel companies is one of the biggest struggles of them all. But capitalism presents us with no end of potential areas of struggle, so I'm just going to give some current examples today. Heat. Given the rising number of days in the year where we face unbearable heat, we have to make sure that employment standards governing unsafe working conditions not only include maximum temperatures, but ensure there is sufficient enforcement of these regulations. For example, under Ontario's Occupational Health and Safety Act, employers must provide a safe work environment, but there's very little in the way of specifying maximum temperatures, and more troubling is that there is little in the way of enforcement for either this act or the Employment Standards Act. There's an organization called the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety, and it does provide maximum temperatures for different types of work, but again, they're just guidelines. There's no enforcement mechanism. So in May of this year, the Ontario Federation of Labour, along with frontline workers and some Ontario NDP MPPs, demanded immediate passage of something called the Heat Stress Act, a private member's bill that would establish enforceable heat protection standards for workers. So that's an ongoing battle, as you can imagine, with Doug Ford. A second area where people can get involved and are involved is this so-called nation building that Lizzie mentioned earlier. And right now there's opposition from Indigenous communities, environmental groups, the NDP, and even a large number of municipal mayors who oppose Carney's choice of what he calls nation-building projects, as they tend to focus on projects with a really large carbon footprint. For example, doubling the production of liquefied natural gas at LNG Canada in northern BC. And don't get me started on Carney's offer to Trump. Maybe we could revisit the Keystone XL pipeline. Instead, we are demanding decent jobs that would truly build communities that meet people's needs and mitigate against fossil fuel use. Things like massively expanding public transit, using construction workers' skills to actually build all the affordable housing we desperately need, and to retrofit existing homes to be more energy efficient, and expand our care sector so that students get the education they deserve and patients obtain the care that they need. The Justice for Workers campaign, are people familiar with Justice for Workers campaign? And so they've been fighting, for years now around things like decent pay, benefits, etc. And decent jobs are by definition good climate jobs. Better work means a stronger working class and a stronger climate justice movement. The third one I'll mention is there's kind of the twin Bill 5 and Bill C5. And these are linked to opposition to Ontario's Bill 5 and the federal Bill C5, which Doug Ford and his pal Mark Carney claim are needed to fast-track all these wonderful nation-building projects and ignore the hard-won laws and policies that protect nature and workers. So we can work with communities and organizations, and there are many of them, who are fighting this legislation. For example, on May 12th, advocates from civil liberties, environmental, and Indigenous organizations, including Environmental Defense, Democracy Watch, the Association of Iroquois and Allied Indians, Friends of the Attawapiskat River, and members of the Neskantaga First Nation, rallied at Queen's Park to oppose Doug Ford's legislation. And here in Toronto, there's the Kill Bill 5 encampment by Indigenous individuals with the same purpose, and linking their demands with those of Grassy Narrows First Nation struggles for decades now around the impact of mercury poisoning and logging. And it's always necessary to work with others. The biggest weakness of the working class, here and in many parts of the world, is the division, mainly stoked by the ruling class for its own ends. We must vocally and visibly oppose all measures against immigrants, whether international students or undocumented workers. And we need to stand with our two-spirited LGBTQ friends to resist the culture wars and dangerous legislation waged most openly by the Alberta government, but resonating with other conservative groups. So that's just some examples. I know you'll have many more to suggest of current struggles where we can link labor and climate justice groups. But what do you think we need to do in the long term to achieve a socialist society, and what might that look like, where climate justice would be a priority?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that a lot of these short-term things, as you've said, do kind of build towards this long-term goal of revolution. We have to build the confidence of the workers and give these examples of success before people can feel confident enough to say, actually, we are knowledgeable as workers. We can take this into our own hands. It's important to recognize that our climate demands are transitional. They can't be met under capitalism. For example, the demand of ending fossil fuels won't be met while there's still profits to be made from fossil fuels. And so we need to kind of dream of how to replace these existing systems. Under socialism, workers would decide what we produce, how we produce it, what are the things that we don't really need to be producing, there's all sorts of things we make that we don't really need to be making, under a worker-led future, we could make those decisions for ourselves, and have the principles of fairness and equity driving them. Before preparing for this talk, I'd never heard of the struggle of the JKN factory workers, and I often struggled with concrete examples of how we can align climate and labor, climate activists would kind of come and be like, what do you mean labor is the key to climate activism? I don't understand that. And it was really Valerie who actually shared this example of the factory workers for me to look into. And I think that being involved in a revolutionary organization like Spring is really critical for taking the time to look into these solutions that are out there, that workers are demonstrating are out there. I think it even applies to my own field. I work as a health worker, and being able to reframe my job as a low carbon job that is, underpaid and care work is feminized and it's underpaid and it's precarious, and reframing that as a low carbon job is a way that we can help to push for climate justice. And so this is kind of just me launching into my pitch for Spring. I would encourage folks here to consider signing up to be a member of Spring. We've got our sign up sheet right here. Creating spaces for political discussion and kind of really being in discussion with other socialists is really essential so that we can come up with these ideas that actually work for workers and also are sustainable for the climate or provide us with a livable future. So thank you so much everybody for coming, and I'll throw it back to Nina.